The monastery stood at the edge of the valley like a memory that refused to fade. Its walls were a century too old, its bells too cracked to carry more than a whisper, and yet each dawn, its shadow stretched long and faithful across the frost-bitten fields. The brothers who lived within did not speak of miracles. They no longer believed in them. Time had turned miracles into burdens, stories to be polished and guarded, like the bones of their patron saint lying beneath the altar in the crypt below. The saint's name was Brother Caldus, a hermit canonized long after his death, said to have lived in silence for 40 years and to have died mid-prayer, his breath still misting the air as if reluctant to leave. His body had never decayed, they said, a sign of divine favor. It lay preserved in a crystal reliquary, sealed centuries ago. A silent testament to obedience. Pilgrims once traveled across kingdoms to glimpse his face beneath the glass. Now only monks passed the crypt steps, carrying candles that flickered low against the stone. It began on an evening when the air felt strangely alive. Brother Terran, keeper of the relic chamber, descended the stair to trim the candles before Compline. He knew the path by heart, could walk it blindfolded, the 12 steps down, the turn left, the sound of dripping water that marked the corner before the crypt's bronze gate. That night the air was heavier, the wax smell sharper. When his candle guttered near the reliquary, he bent to shield it with his hand, and saw something he did not yet understand. A thin fog lay upon the inside of the glass. Not a film of dust, nor the pale bloom of candle soot, but condensation. Breath. It shimmered faintly in the flicker, receding as he leaned closer. For a long moment he knelt, thinking it some trick of temperature, a seep of moisture from the cold stone beneath. Then he saw it again, a small bloom of mist spreading across the interior, dissipating like the exhale of a sleeping man. He felt the world narrow around that sight. The silence deepened until he could hear the pulse behind his ear. His knees shook against the flagstones. He rose, backing away, his candle wavering, its flame distorting the saint's face through the glass. Beneath the film of centuries, the flesh remained whole, the mouth slightly parted, the skin drawn but not withered. And in that half-open mouth he thought he saw movement. He did not tell the abbot that night. He went instead to the chapel, knelt in the last pew and prayed until dawn. Yet prayer would not unsee what had been seen. By the next evening he returned to the crypt with 2 others, silent men who trusted in ritual more than reason. Together they knelt before the reliquary and watched. The candles burned low. Hours passed. Nothing stirred. One of them sighed with relief. And then the glass fogged again. 3 breaths. Slow, faint, and terribly human, words spread quietly. The brothers spoke only in whispers, fearing the weight of their own words. The abbot, an old man bent beneath more faith than strength, descended with the key of the reliquary that had not been turned in 2 centuries. He prayed aloud as he knelt. His voice trembled, half choked, as though he spoke not to God but to the thing that slept below. Then he touched the glass, felt warmth where there should have been none, and withdrew his hand as if burned. The body was untouched, no sign of decay, no color of death. The breath fogged and vanished again. The abbot wept, not in wonder but in dread. A living saint was not a miracle. A saint that would not die was a warning. For 3 nights they watched the tomb. The breath came at irregular intervals, sometimes faint, sometimes long, as though drawing strength from the prayers recited above. The monks stopped ringing the bells at lauds. They sang softer hymns. The sound of chanting seemed to stir the air below. Some claimed they heard a low sigh echo from the crypt during Mass. The abbot sent word to the bishop, but no messenger returned. The valley had long been forgotten by Rome. Winter closed the passes and snow sealed them within their walls. Faith turned inward. Fear ripened like fruit in silence. Brother Terran began to dream of the reliquary. In his dreams the glass pulsed with light, the saint's eyes opening in slow reverence. The face was calm, yet its lips moved without sound. He would wake before dawn, drenched in cold sweat, the echo of that voiceless murmur still in his ears. He started keeping watch alone, candle in hand, whispering the psalms that once comforted him. Each night the breath grew stronger, the mist larger, lasting longer upon the glass. When spring thawed the valley, the abbot ordered the reliquary sealed with wax and iron. The monks obeyed, though none dared approach the tomb without trembling. Yet the air of the crypt never cooled again. The warmth persisted, faint but steady, like the breath of a furnace hidden beneath the stone. In the refectory, no one spoke of miracles anymore. They spoke of endurance, of the cost of holiness, of the body that refused the rest of death. They whispered that sanctity too could hunger, that perhaps the saint had never ceased praying, never ceased waiting for absolution, and above them, in the chapel where candles guttered beneath the cracked frescoes, the air grew strangely close, as though the monastery itself were holding its breath. The abbot forbade the brothers from descending into the crypt alone. He decreed that the tomb was not to be touched, not to be spoken of except in prayer, and not to be seen except during the appointed hours of vigil. The decree itself became a kind of temptation. Silence always invites listening. By the third week of Lent, more candles burned in the lower passage than in the chapel above. The reliquary had changed. The warmth it gave off spread through the floor like a slow fever. Wax ran quicker down the sides of every candle, pooling in soft, pale tears at the base of the saint's glass coffin. The brothers felt the change in their lungs, a moist heaviness, as if the air had become part breath, part prayer. Each night, when they came to kneel before the saint, they began to whisper blessings into the glass. Some pressed their foreheads against it. Others left tokens of devotion, a thread from a robe, a strip of parchment inscribed with a verse, even locks of hair. No one admitted to fear. They called it reverence. Yet reverence and fear are two sides of the same silence. The abbot himself stayed apart. He no longer led mass. His voice, once clear and full, had thinned to a whisper. He spent his hours writing by candlelight, letters addressed to bishops who would never read them, sealing each with wax that bore no crest. When he did speak to the brethren, his eyes darted toward the floor, as if sound itself might awaken what lay below. It was Brother Terran who noticed the next change. The breath within the glass had grown rhythmic, not random, not shallow, but patterned, deliberate, as though joined to a pulse. He placed his hand upon the reliquary and felt it, faint as a prayer, the slow rise and fall of living flesh beneath the saint's habit. He drew back, trembling, then knelt again and began to pray, not for a miracle but for understanding. The words caught in his throat. Somewhere in the distance a bell cracked mid-strike. The brothers grew restless. The crypt's air had turned too warm to bear for long. At night, strange dampness formed upon the walls, not water, not entirely, a faint sweet scent of decay, like old myrrh mixed with breath. The oldest of the monks began coughing blood during vigils. The younger ones spoke of visions, the saint's lips moving in silent benediction, a faint light behind his closed eyelids. The feeling of being watched through the glass. Still they continued their rites. Faith does not break cleanly. It softens first like wax under flame. By the time the abbot finally descended again, the crypt was alive with murmurs, prayers, recitations, the low hum of human need. He saw the reliquary surrounded by brothers on their knees, their faces upturned toward the misted glass. In their eyes was a light that frightened him more than disbelief ever could. He commanded them to stop. None moved. The faint fog spread once more upon the glass, and with it came something they all felt. Warmth, breathing outward. The air seemed to pulse in time with an unseen heart. One of the younger monks fainted, his head striking the stone. Another began to laugh, a dry, broken sound that turned to sobbing. The abbot approached and placed his hand upon the glass. It was no longer warm. It was hot. He recoiled, his palm reddened. The saint's lips had parted further, and between them something gleamed, not teeth, but the glint of wetness, a thread of life that had no right to remain. That night, he ordered the reliquary sealed behind the altar wall. The brothers obeyed, but reluctantly, as if sealing their own hope away. The next morning the chapel smelled of smoke. Wax dripped from the candles in streams. The air was so thick with heat that they opened the windows for the first time in decades. Still, the warmth did not fade. The breath continued, muted now, muffled by stone, but no less steady. The abbot forbade further vigils. He burned the keys to the crypt in the refectory fire. Yet the brothers still prayed in secret, gathering at night by the altar, their chants low and tremulous, drawn from the rhythm that had begun beneath their feet. And slowly, they began to believe again. Not in God, but in the body that refused him. The relic became their new gospel. They spoke of it not as a saint, but as sanctus viventum, the living holy. Their prayers grew longer. Their sleep grew shorter. Some began to fast, believing that to eat was to deny the miracle. Their faces hollowed. Their eyes burned. Still, they chanted hour after hour, until their voices blurred into one endless breath. The abbot watched this sickness spread through his flock and felt the sin of it coil inside him. Faith had turned to fever, reverence to hunger. He could not tell where worship ended and contagion began. In the long, sleepless nights, he thought he heard something moving beneath the altar. Not a voice. Not quite, but the faint rasp of breath against stone, steady as the tolling of a distant bell. By the first frost of winter, the abbot could no longer tell whether he prayed for the saint's peace or his own. Snow fell early that year, but the roads did not stay empty. A rumor had slipped from the valley like smoke through a cracked window. A tale of a saint who breathed within his tomb, a promise of warmth in the heart of winter. It carried through the merchants who traded salt for wine, through beggars who slept by ruined shrines, until it reached villages that had forgotten the monastery even existed. When the first pilgrims arrived, the brothers did not open the gate. They watched from the parapet as shapes gathered in the snow, muffled in wool and silence. None called out. They merely knelt and waited, their breath rising like incense toward the dark stone walls. By the second week, there were dozens. Men, women, even children. They built small fires at the edge of the road, prayed through the nights, and left offerings at the locked doors. Bread, cloth, broken rosaries, a drop of blood pressed into snow. The abbot ordered them to go, but his voice did not reach that far. Each morning more came. Each evening more candles burned along the path. Their hymns were wordless, a humming that blended with the wind, matching the slow rhythm that beat beneath the chapel floor. Inside, the monastery had changed. The air was always warm now, faintly scented with iron and wax. Candles melted faster than they could be replaced. The brothers' robes stuck to their skin. At night they lay awake, listening to the breathing below, the faint whisper through stone. It seemed stronger when they prayed aloud, as though the saint drew breath from their voices. Some began to press their ears to the floor, whispering confessions they no longer dared speak to one another. Brother Terran kept count of the heartbeats he felt through the stone. He said they matched the tolling of the bells, though the bells had long been silent. He marked the rhythm on parchment, line after line, until it filled the page like a psalm written by an unseen hand. When he finally slept, he dreamed of a lung made of marble, drawing air from the earth itself. The abbot ceased writing his letters. He spent his days in the chapel, staring at the sealed wall that hid the reliquary. The warmth emanated through the altar stones, and sometimes he thought he felt a pulse beneath his fingertips. The words of the Mass blurred in his mind, life everlasting. And he could no longer tell if the phrase was prayer or curse. He forbade the brothers to feed the pilgrims or speak to them, yet each night offerings vanished from the gate. Someone always carried them down to the crypt stairs and left them there, where the air trembled faintly with heat. When the thaw came, the pilgrims broke the silence themselves. A woman fainted near the gate and was carried inside. Her breath came shallow, her eyes closed, but when they laid her near the chapel steps, she sighed. A long, contented breath that misted in the warm air. The brothers watched as her chest rose again, slow and even, perfectly matching the unseen rhythm below. By dawn she was dead, yet her lips still parted, exhaling the faintest trace of warmth. They buried her by the outer wall. Snow melted over her grave before the sun reached it. After that, the brothers stopped resisting the crowd. They opened the doors during matins, letting a few inside at a time. The pilgrims entered barefoot, silent, heads bowed. None asked to see the reliquary. They simply knelt on the stone, hands outstretched to feel the heat that pulsed through the floor. The abbot tried to pray over them, but the words fell useless. Their mouths moved in unison, murmuring to the breath below, voices blending into one low note that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was during one such vigil that the wax seal cracked. The sound was small, almost polite, a sigh rather than a shatter. Yet everyone heard it. The chanting stopped. Dust drifted from the altar joints. A faint exhalation passed through the chapel, carrying with it the scent of old lilies and grave soil. Candles flared without wind. The pilgrims pressed their faces to the floor, whispering blessings until their throats bled. The brothers froze where they knelt, torn between terror and awe. Only the abbot moved. He crossed himself once, then descended alone into the crypt. When he reached the chamber, the iron bands lay broken on the reliquary lid. The glass glistened with condensation from within. He knelt, trembling as the fog blossomed and receded, again and again, with the calm rhythm of breath. For a moment he believed he saw the saint's chest rise beneath the vestments. A soft tapping echoed from inside, 3 knocks evenly spaced. He realized his own heartbeat had fallen into perfect measure with it. He fled before dawn, leaving the gate unlocked behind him. No one followed. By sunrise, the pilgrims had entered the monastery in silence. They moved through the halls barefoot, carrying candles that dripped onto their hands without pain. One by one they gathered in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. The brothers joined them without command. There was no leader. No prayer, only breath. A single inhalation drawn from 100 throats, released together into the still air. It rose in mist that hung below the ceiling like a second congregation. Outside, the valley filled with fog. The church bell tolled once, though the rope had long been cut. Far below in the crypt, the breath deepened. The glass of the reliquary dimmed under a film of moisture that did not fade. And when the abbot looked back from the mountain path, he saw the monastery alive with candlelight, hundreds of flames flickering behind every window. Breathing in unison, as though the building itself had learned to live. The abbot returned 3 nights later. He had walked through rain that turned to snow, through a silence that pressed against his skull like the palm of a hand. He carried nothing with him now. No scripture, no relic, only the weight of what he had fled. The monastery rose through the mist like the ribs of a corpse, its windows alive with faint, trembling light. He entered without resistance. The doors stood open, and the smell of candle smoke and warm air drifted into the night like breath. Inside, all was still. No footsteps echoed, no voices prayed. The chapel doors stood ajar, and from within came the soft sound of breathing. Hundreds of lungs drawing one single breath, held in suspension. The abbot stepped inside. The pews were full. Brothers and pilgrims alike sat motionless, eyes closed, heads bowed, their chests rising and falling together. Candlelight shimmered across their faces, pale and moist, as though they had just stepped from water. Between them, wax had pooled into rivers along the floor. The heat was stifling. The air pulsed like a living thing. He could hear the rhythm in his bones, the slow beat beneath the altar stones. The breath below had grown stronger, no longer a whisper but the deep, slow exhalation of something waking from a long and merciful sleep. He walked down the center aisle, each step sinking into melted wax. None turned to see him. Their mouths hung slightly open, lips wet, releasing faint clouds of mist that drifted upward and vanished near the vaulted ceiling. The candles nearest the altar burned higher than the rest, their flames elongating, wavering as if stirred by a current of air from below. He reached the altar and knelt. The stone beneath his knees was warm, not from the candles, not from the crowd, but from within. A low hum vibrated through it, steady and slow, the sound of a distant bell. His hands trembled as he touched the carved edge, feeling the pulse that throbbed beneath the surface. It was not the rhythm of heartbeats, but of breathing. A lung made of stone, a chest that rose and fell beneath the weight of sanctity. He pressed his ear to the altar. The sound filled him. It was not one breath, but many, layered into a harmony too perfect to be human. It was prayer turned inside out, breath made eternal, refusing to end. Tears filled his eyes. For a moment, he felt peace, the same peace promised in every sermon he had ever spoken. Then came the faint sound beneath the breath. A slow, wet creaking, like bone bending under strain. He pulled back and saw the first crack appear in the stone. Thin as a thread, running down the altar's center, glowing faintly with moisture. A drop fell, dark and viscous, landing on his sleeve. It was warm, smelling faintly of incense and blood. He staggered to his feet. The congregation did not move. Their breathing deepened, matching the rhythm below. The crack widened. The stone split with a sound like a sigh. From within came a mist, pale and living, carrying the scent of centuries-old air. It rolled across the floor, curling around the abbot's feet, climbing the steps, winding between the pews. The faces of the seated figures tilted upward, eyes still closed, mouths still open, as if to receive communion from the invisible air. The abbot watched as one by one their chests stilled. Not from suffocation, but as if the breath had been taken back into the earth. The reliquary beneath the altar began to glow through the mist. The glass shimmered with moisture from inside, fog blooming faster than before, until nothing could be seen but the faint outline of the body within. Then the glass bulged outward, a long soft crack like an exhale, a sound of release. The glass gave way, spilling warmth into the room like blood into water. The saint's body did not rise. It did not move, but the breath came free, a visible cloud, white and shining, spreading like light made of mist. It rolled upward and outward, wrapping around the abbot, pressing against his skin with gentle, living weight. It smelled of myrrh, of old wax, of graves opened too early. He fell to his knees again, tears streaking his face. The warmth entered him, filling his lungs, pushing out every word he had ever memorized. The congregation shuddered once in unison. A soft sound escaped them, not quite song, not quite sigh. The breath passed through them, one body to another, until each chest rose once more, not by their own will, but as if moved by a single will beneath the earth. When the abbot opened his eyes, the world had dimmed. The candles burned low, their flames steady now, unwavering. The faces before him were serene, eyes still closed, their mouths relaxed in faint smiles. The mist settled, heavy and still, glowing faintly with its own inner light. The crack in the altar sealed itself, the stone cooling slowly beneath his hands. The reliquary below was empty. He tried to pray, but the words felt foreign. The language of men no longer belonged here. The breath he drew carried weight, warmth, memory, the taste of another's lungs. He understood then what the brothers had always feared to say, that holiness had not left the body because holiness had nowhere else to go. Sanctity had become hunger. Eternity had found breath. When dawn came, the valley was still. The mist had rolled outward, down the mountain over the fields. Travelers who passed in later years spoke of the smell of wax and lilies that lingered in the air, and of a faint warmth that seemed to rise from the ground even in winter. The monastery itself was empty, though candles still burned behind its windows, never melting, never dimming. Those who dared to enter said it felt as though someone had just sighed, long and content, in the moment before prayer begins. Centuries passed like the slow turning of ash in an extinguished brazier. The monastery stood, but not as memory had left it. The mountains folded inward around its stones, ivy threading through the cracks where incense once rose. Wind carried the low hum of bees nesting in the choir loft, and rain moved through the open roof like baptism without witness. Yet still the air inside was warm, unnaturally so, as if the stones themselves remembered the body they once guarded. Travelers found it by accident. A scholar tracing the lives of forgotten saints, a pilgrim seeking silence, a boy fleeing hunger. They spoke afterward in letters or confessions of the same sensation, that upon entering the nave, one's breath no longer belonged entirely to oneself. The air came slower, deeper, and the chest filled as though guided by another rhythm. Some left trembling, crossing themselves without knowing why. Others stayed and slept upon the floor, waking with tears dried upon their faces and the faint taste of candle smoke in their mouths. The scholar who stayed longest wrote by lamplight. His notes cramped and hurried, his ink drying before he could finish a line. He traced the legend of the saint who would not die, the glass reliquary that fogged from within, the monks who turned their prayers into silence. He described the air as living, a thin veil of warmth that moves as one would breathe. On the third night, he recorded the sound of it, pressing his ear against the altar stones. The tape captured nothing but the faint pulse of static, like wind crossing a microphone. But he swore he heard something else beneath it. A slow inhalation, ancient and unbroken, carrying through centuries like a hymn sung under the earth. He did not leave. His notes ended midway through a sentence describing the color of the candle flame. When a search party found the place years later, the candles were still burning, short, pale stubs that never melted further. His recorder sat beside them, the tape running endlessly, reel against reel, whispering a soft rhythm of breath no one could quite name. In the valley below, stories multiplied. Farmers said their cattle refused to graze near the slope where the monastery shadow fell at dawn. Children spoke of the hill exhaling fog that smelled faintly of oil and wine. Priests came and left quickly, unwilling to stay the night. Some carried vials of the warm air in sealed glass, claiming it to be miraculous. Others warned that to breathe it was to take into oneself the hunger of the undying. Inside, the walls had begun to change. The murals, once faded, darkened again as though ink had risen through plaster. Faces of saints that had long vanished began to reappear, not painted but grown. The color of candle soot forming lines, eyes, mouths slightly open. Each mouth seemed to whisper, though no sound came. The air rippled faintly around them when one passed close, the way a held breath disturbs dust. In winter, snow never settled on the roof. The ground beneath remained soft, damp, faintly warm even in frost. Birds nested in the rafters but never sang. At dusk, the last light through the broken windows turned the air to silver. And for a moment the mist took shape, not of saints, nor monks, but of figures standing motionless, heads bowed, lips parted in eternal devotion. There came a time when a restoration crew was sent from the city, men in heavy coats with cameras and lights. They entered laughing, talking of preservation and grant funding. Within the hour their voices quieted. The air was too close, too alive. Their lights flickered, the batteries were new. One man, touching the altar, drew back with a gasp, claiming it moved beneath his palm. They packed their tools in silence and left before sundown. Their report was never filed. Only one photograph remained, a single frame showing the nave empty, yet blurred near the altar, as though the lens had caught the ghost of a breath mid-air. Now, only the wind enters freely. It moves through the broken archways, gathering dust and carrying it outward like scattered prayers. The candles still stand, thin, infinite, their flames steady as if untouched by time. The air hums softly. Sometimes, when night is still, a faint mist rises from the floor, glowing with the warmth of unseen lungs. Those who stand too long at the threshold feel their heartbeats slow, aligning with something vast and ancient below. It is said that on the coldest nights, when the moon hangs white over the valley, the monastery exhales, a single, gentle sigh that rolls across the fields and into the village, touching windows, moving curtains, setting candles, trembling on altars far away. Some wake at that hour, clutching their chests, certain they have heard a prayer whispered not in words but in breath. They say the saint never died. Perhaps that was true. Or perhaps death itself paused in reverence, unwilling to touch what had already become sacred. Either way, the air still moves, and thin, patient, and endless, a reminder that faith, once taken too deeply, never fully leaves the lungs of the world. And when dawn comes, the monastery glows faintly in the fog, its walls steaming with the warmth of something within. From a distance it looks as though the mountain itself is breathing,